Hopefully the microphone picked all that cheering up. How's everybody doing? Having fun? How many of you were here for the first session today? Most of you? I promise not to repeat the same jokes. No, that's not true. So we're going to talk about sharing our images today. How many of you have images worth sharing? I don't. And so first, we're going to talk about the develop module where we can make our images appear worth sharing. So I'm going to talk about optimizing our images in Lightroom and then sharing in a variety of different ways. I'll spend most of the time focused on improving the appearance of our images, taking a look at the various features that are available in Lightroom for optimizing the appearance of our photos. And then I'll spend a smaller chunk of the time talking about sharing. And part of the reason for that is that in Lightroom, one of the things that I actually really appreciate about Lightroom is that there's a consistency in terms of the interface and therefore in terms of the workflow. For those of you that are already familiar with Lightroom, you know there's a left panel and a right panel. We do some stuff over on the left, and then we do more detailed things over on the right. And what that translates into is that because we have that consistency, once you know how to use one of the sharing modules in Lightroom, you pretty much know how to use all of the sharing modules in Lightroom. And obviously there are some differences. The process of creating a book that you're going to print with blurb is a little bit different from the process of creating a slideshow that you're going to play on a digital projector. But in terms of the overall workflow and the basic concept, there's a lot of similarity there, and so it makes it pretty easy as far as basically translating your knowledge from one of the modules to another. So it's one of the things that I actually really like about the workflow within Lightroom is that it just sort of, it makes sense, and a bit of knowledge that you gain in one area translates into another area of Lightroom. So we're going to focus most of our attention, or at least our initial attention, on the develop module. For those of you that are not especially familiar with Lightroom, Lightroom is divided into individual modules that essentially divide based on workflow. So first and foremost, we want to get our images organized, right? Because we actually want to be able to find the picture that we're looking for so that we can share it with somebody. And so that's what the library module is there for, is to help us organize our images, to manage our images. And then we have the develop module, which we'll spend some time looking at in a moment, which allows us to optimize our images. And then the map module, which is for organizing our images based on location. We can literally plot our images on the map so that we always know where a particular image was captured, for example. And then we have the various sharing modules, and that includes the book module, the slideshow module, the print module, and the web module. So let's dive in, because I have plenty of images that need some work. Now I should stress, I'm sure I'll repeat myself multiple times on this topic throughout the session here. It's very, very important that all of you keep in mind that every single image that you're seeing today has some issues that need improvement. All of those issues were created intentionally on purpose. Why are you laughing? So that I could show you. So I actually spent extra time taking, I took the image the right way, and then I intentionally messed up the settings on my camera so that I could take it the wrong way and show you how you might fix those issues. Right? Is anybody going to believe that? No, probably not. So we're going to start off with color adjustments, and mostly we're starting with color adjustments because they show up at the top of the list on the right panel in the develop module. More often than not, I actually tend to start with exposure adjustments, not because I'm choosing to do things out of order, although that is a reason I do certain things, but mostly because I want to focus on sort of the biggest issue first. And most of the time, the biggest issue is exposure. And now that's not to suggest that most of my exposures are bad, but rather that even when the exposure is pretty good, that's still the adjustment that I'm most likely to apply the most significant adjustment to. It's the thing that I'm going to focus the most attention on. Most of the time, the images come out of the camera looking pretty good as far as color. Most of the time, the camera does a pretty good job. I leave my camera set to the auto white balance option because I don't want to forget to change it later, and because I'm shooting raw, and so it really doesn't matter most of the time. But sometimes the camera gets it wrong. Any of you photograph indoor, theater or sports or anything like that, you can certainly appreciate that the camera will get it very wrong sometimes, especially under mixed lighting conditions. Here, for example, we have an image that was captured at night with a lot of artificial lighting and some mixed lighting, and so that's not exactly what the scene looked like. It looks way too yellow in this particular rendition, and it's just that the camera didn't quite get it right as far as what the color of the light was and therefore what it needs to compensate for. So in this case, we're going to start with color temperature just because it's the first set of adjustments. Normally I'm starting with whatever I decide is the most important adjustment for an image, and then I'll sort of work my way down in terms of priority from there. But the beauty of it is, it doesn't matter what order you apply these adjustments in. With Lightroom in the Develop module, we're always working non-destructively, so we don't have to worry about damaging our original pixels. And Lightroom is always applying the specific adjustments that we've chosen in the order that Lightroom decides it wants to apply them. The order in which we touch all the sliders and buttons and knobs on that right panel in the Develop module makes no difference at all. Lightroom's doing it Lightroom's way, so we can bounce around any way we want, manipulating those controls in order to optimize the appearance of the photo. So don't feel like you need to start from the top and work your way down, or that you can't jump down to noise reduction first if you've got a noisy image or whatever the case may be. Any order is perfectly fine. I'm just going to start top to bottom because then I don't lose track of where I am. So when it comes to adjusting the color in the image, we're generally talking about color temperature. And it's not that that's the only way we can adjust color. It's not even the only way we need to think about color. It's just the way that Lightroom tends to think about color, or at least presents the color to us. And that, in large part, is because that's the way the camera is functioning. The camera is adjusting based on color temperature. In other words, is the lighting really warm, or yellowish, orangish, reddish? Or is the light relatively cool? Blues, greens, cyans, for example. In other words, which direction do we need to shift the color in order to get an accurate result? Well, there's several ways that we can go about applying that adjustment. I only use one way because I'm set in my ways and because I'm a control freak, and so I'm always going to manipulate the individual sliders anyway, so there's no sense using these other controls most of the time. But let's take a look at those other controls because it can actually be a little bit instructive for us. First off, we have a pop-up here over on the right panel, and I'm working in the basic section over on the right panel in the Develop module, and I've got a pop-up under that color section. You'll see WB here for white balance. If I click that pop-up, you'll see a set of options that hopefully look rather familiar because these are the exact same settings you'll find on your camera. And so I can see what the image would look like if I had set my camera to fluorescent, for example, or tungsten, or whatever the case might be. I'll set it to shade. There we go. So shady light is a very cool light, so Lightroom thinks it needs to warm up the image to make it look better. In actual fact, obviously it wasn't shady light, so now the image looks kind of weird. But the point is that we can choose one of the presets which are based exactly on what we would have otherwise set in the camera. But keep in mind, with a raw capture, that setting in the camera, totally irrelevant. Just a convenient setting. It doesn't actually change the capture data, so there's no penalty at all for changing the setting after the fact. If you want to just leave it as it was, in other words, the way the camera interpreted the scene, you can leave that set to as shot. Notice, by the way, that we also have an auto option. This auto option is not the same as the auto option that you have on your camera. Auto on the camera means the camera should look at the light that's coming through the lens and try and figure out what is the color temperature of the light. Auto in Lightroom means Lightroom should look at your picture with absolutely no knowledge of where you were, what you're photographing, what the wavelengths of light were, or anything else, and it should make a determination about how to apply that adjustment. Sometimes it actually does a reasonably good job. Sometimes not so good. But the point is that we can choose from these settings, and they're the same or similar to, depending on the particular option, to what we would find on the camera. So instructive in terms of what results you might achieve. Sometimes it's a nice little shortcut. You've probably all heard of the little trick to always set your white balance to cloudy, because cloudy light is cool light. We all like warm images, so if you set your camera's white balance to cloudy, every image is going to come out a little bit warmer than it otherwise would have. Sometimes that works out great, sometimes not so much, but again, with raw capture, there's no penalty for doing so. The other option besides that pop-up, I'll leave that set to as shot for the moment, Besides the pop-up, we have this little eyedropper over here, and that's our white balance tool. And I can use that eyedropper to sample a color within the image. But what I'm really doing is saying, hey Lightroom, you see this little pixel right here? This pixel should be perfectly neutral gray. So can you please apply an adjustment that causes that pixel to appear gray? As a result, the rest of the image will of course be adjusted in the same way, and hopefully that will result in an improvement. Well, this seems pretty straightforward. And I hear people talk about this all the time in the context of, oh, well, I'll just put a gray card in the corner of the scene, and then I'll click on it, and I'll crop out the gray card later. There's only one real problem with that. Specifically, what are the odds that you want something that is actually really truly gray to appear gray? If you want a gray object in the real world to appear gray in your photos, you're very lucky, because now you can sleep in until noon. Because there's no reason to photograph under golden light, right? At golden hour, what color is the gray card? A slightly yellowish gray. So what are the odds that you actually want a gray object to appear gray? So that's my first concern with using the eyedropper to sample an area. Also, then I got to find the right area to click on. So I click on that greenish area and the image comes out a little too magenta. I click on this yellowish area and the image comes out too blue. And I click on, oh, okay, that's not too bad. So now I've got to try and go find just the right pixel to click on, and that can be a little bit of a process, as you can see. And so regardless of which approach I think I might want to take, eventually I'm probably going to go to the temperature and tint sliders. And so my feeling is I might as well just go directly to the temperature and tint sliders. The temperature slider allows us to shift between yellow and blue. So it's essentially warming and cooling. The tint slider allows us to shift between magenta and green. Now, generally speaking, I find a lot of photographers who want to have a warm image or a cool image. I don't find a lot of photographers who want a magenta image versus a green image. And so the temperature slider tends to be both corrective and creative, whereas the tint slider tends to be purely corrective. And furthermore, with the temperature slider, you're likely or more likely to apply a rather strong adjustment, whereas with the tint slider, you're probably going to make a relatively modest adjustment. How many of you feel like you don't have a good eye for color? How many feel like you have an excellent, amazing, perfect eye for color? How many of you are just too lazy to raise your hands? Still only like 4 hands. The whole... A lot of photographers, obviously none here, feel that they don't have a good eye for color. They don't feel like they have a bad eye for color. They don't feel like they have a good eye for color. They don't feel like they're too lazy to raise their hand. We just don't know what the issue is. But a lot of photographers express that they don't feel that they have a very good eye for color. That actually is a problem that I think is relatively easily solved. I promise you it is possible to develop your eye for color, to improve your ability to perceive those colors. And one of the little tricks that I encourage to help that process along is to apply extreme adjustments. Does anyone think this is an improvement upon the original version of the image? Just one. How about that? Moonlit night, right? Very romantic. It's sort of an improvement because the original was a little too warm. But the point is that if you go through those extremes, rarely are you going to find that the extremes are very good. They're usually going to be a little silly looking. So you start by swinging through those extremes. What you don't even know when you're doing that is that you're actually training your mind to understand the differences between those color shifts. And so you'll actually start to recognize what will happen to various colors as you shift the color in different directions. It's not that I could quiz you on, okay, you have RGB values of X, Y, and Z, and I'm adding, 50 degrees Kelvin. Now what are the new RGB values? No, but you'll have a sense of which direction you need to go. Is it going to be a big adjustment or a small adjustment? And you'll actually be able to look at an image and say, that needs to be shifted a little bit toward yellow and a tiny bit toward magenta, for example. In this case, not toward yellow. Obviously, you want to go the other direction. But if you swing through those wild extremes, you'll be able to see right away. Sort of like when you throw a lens completely out of focus. Oh, well, that's way off and that's way off. But now I can start to kind of zero in on, maybe somewhere around there, give or take. So you'll get a better sense of where that sweet spot is for that particular adjustment. Again, with temperature, we're able to make a relatively large swing in one direction or the other and still get good results. And of course, you do have a certain degree of artistic license here. You can, cheat a little and warm things up because you've overslept and didn't make it for golden light. Right? We can then turn our attention to tint. Here, we don't really need to do the whole extreme swing all the way to one end versus the other because frankly, we don't need much of an adjustment. Even a relatively modest shift of that tint slider will give us a relatively obvious change in the image. And so I would just take a very, very small adjustment. In fact, in most cases, with that tint slider, I need such a small adjustment that I start to run into problems where I can't get a very good result with my mouse. Anybody else? I'm just seeing if people are willing to raise their hands now. So this is where I tend to employ this trick that you can actually use in many, many, many situations in Lightroom. It's very helpful. If you find an adjustment, a slider for example, that you just can't exercise the fine degree of control you're looking for with the mouse, simply click inside the numeric value for that particular slider. So over toward the right of the slider, you'll see that I have a value for tint. At the moment, it's set to +19. Now that I've clicked inside that field, I can use the arrow keys on the keyboard to increase with the up arrow or decrease with the down arrow the value for that slider. You'll notice that the slider itself is moving as I press up arrow or down arrow. So up arrow in this case to move to the right, down arrow to the left. For most of these controls, you'll be making an adjustment by values of 1. So we're going +19, +20, +21. In some cases, it'll be very different. With the temperature slider, for example, it's degrees Kelvin, and so the scale's much larger. Sometimes it's fractions of 1, tenths or hundredths. But whatever the case may be, up and down will increase or decrease by a set value. If we want a bigger adjustment, we can add the shift key. So shift up arrow, in this case, will take us by a factor of 10 upward, and shift down arrow downward by a value of 10. So going from +2 to +12 to +22 and down to +12, etc. But the point is that we can use those arrow keys to exercise a little bit of finer control over that color adjustment. All right, so more often than not, I go directly to those temperature and tint sliders. I don't even worry about the pop-up or about the eyedropper because those are just other ways of adjusting the values for the sliders. In my mind, you might as well just start with the sliders, and especially utilizing that trick where you can use your up and down arrow keys on the keyboard in order to adjust the value, I think works out really nicely. All right. So now that I've covered color temperature, we're ready to move on to the exposure adjustments, and I want to underscore right now, for each of these little sections of adjustments, I'm going to switch from one image to another. Obviously, in the real world, you would be applying a series of adjustments to one image, but I think it works out a little bit better if we can use images for each section of adjustment, as it were, that is well suited to that particular adjustment. This image could obviously use some tonal adjustments, but we're just going to move on to a different image in order to apply tonal adjustments. And so now we'll take a look at the next little section, still inside the basic set of adjustments over on the right panel in the Develop module. And with Lightroom 4, we actually had a somewhat dramatic change in some of these adjustment controls, and they were changed again in Lightroom 5. So we've had changes along the way. I think that these set of tonal adjustment controls, though, make perfect sense in terms of how we actually think about our images. So let's take a look at those controls. Exposure used to be more of a white point adjustment, but now it's been changed to the extent that I consider it literally more of an exposure adjustment, and to the point that I apply very modest adjustments, generally speaking, for exposure. And so this I think of as just a fine-tuning adjustment in order to improve the overall appearance of the photo. So I'll apply just a modest brightening of the image, for example. In this case, just a third of a stop brighter. Contrast, I'm not going to touch. And in fact, I almost never use contrast. Not because my images don't need contrast, but because I prefer to take a different approach to achieving that contrast. Every now and then I'll add some contrast or even remove some contrast, but by and large I'll achieve those results through other means. And for most images, those other means are going to be the highlights shadows, whites, and blacks sliders, which I think are wonderful additions or wonderful updates to Lightroom, because now we can both brighten or darken highlights. We used to have the recovery slider where we could only darken highlights. Now we can brighten or darken highlights. We had the fill light slider instead of the shadow slider where we could only brighten the shadows. Now we could brighten or darken the shadows. And we also have the whites and black sliders. Now I do wish these sliders were in a different order, just because I work with them in a different order. First, I want to set my endpoints for the histogram, as it were. In other words, to set the value for white and the value for black. And then I'll fine tune the values in between. So I'm going to switch down to the whites slider. I can brighten or darken the brightest areas of the image. Now, I'm actually affecting, as you can pretty well see, most of the image, but I'm emphasizing the adjustment on the brightest areas. And by brightest areas, I mean really the brightest. In fact, if you take a look at the top right corner, you'll see that there is a highlight on the right end of the histogram that highlights about 10% of the values of the image in terms of tonal value. So I'll drag to the right to brighten the brightest areas of the image, and to the left to darken those areas. So if I had blown out detail in my original capture, I could bring that whites value over to the left to recover some of the whites, hopefully. And if I captured the image a little bit too dark and I want to bring up the value for whites, I can certainly brighten them. But I prefer, since we're talking about an endpoint, an absolute value in terms of that white, I generally prefer to take advantage of the clipping preview option so that I can actually see where in the image I'm losing detail. To do that, I hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while adjusting that value for whites. Initially, at least if there's not any lost detail in the original image, that display will go to black. And then as I increase the value, eventually I'll see pixels start to appear. The color of the pixel indicates which channel or channels are losing detail, and once we see white, that means that that area has been blown out to absolute pure white. Do we want a pure white area in our image? Mostly, generally. Do we want it to be a big, huge blob of an area? No, almost never, pretty much never. So generally speaking, and this is just a general rule as a starting point, generally speaking, I'll increase the value for whites until I start to see pixels appear, and then I'll back off a little bit until maybe I have just a few tiny pixels here and there, or maybe to the point where I have no pixels at all, so that I'm brightening the value for the brightest pixels without sacrificing any detail, or perhaps without sacrificing much detail. I might be willing to lose a little bit of highlight detail, but generally not too much. If there were bright reflections, those I wouldn't worry about too much. But for a typical image, I usually want the brightest area to be very close to white. Not always. There are plenty of exceptions, but more often than not, I would say that is the case. Then we can turn our attention to the blacks, which is exactly the same thing at the opposite end of the scale. So once again, holding the Alt key on Windows, Option key on Macintosh, we can reduce the value for the darkest pixels or increase the value for the darkest pixels. In other words, do we want to block up shadow detail? Do I want to completely lose shadow detail? Maybe. Sometimes. For a silhouette, for example. Not usually a lot of detail. Maybe I'll sacrifice just a small area of the image. More often than, more often than not, I want either just a couple of pixels that are black or maybe a small area that's black. Sometimes I don't want any black pixels at all. It just depends on the particular scene that I photographed. But by and large, it's the same basic process as with whites. I'm going to go to the point where pixels start to block up in those shadow areas and then back off a little bit, so slide back over toward the right until there are very few pixels or perhaps none at all, again, depending on my particular aim for the photo. So what I've essentially done at this point is maximize the tonal range for the image. The brightest pixel is right about white, the darkest pixel is right about black. That's not always the best solution, but it works pretty well much of the time. But then I get to turn my attention to the values in between, and that's where the shadows and highlights come into play. So we'll start off with highlights. If I drag over to the right, you'll see, in this case, the head feathers of the eagle are the most dominant area in terms of those bright areas. I can brighten them or darken them. So I can brighten them up if I really want to emphasize that area as a bright portion of the photo, or I can tone that area down a little bit if I want to accentuate some of the detail, to sort of recover some of the detail. So in this case, for example, I've already established a white point. I might then want to tone down those bright areas in order to preserve as much of that feather detail. I didn't actually lose any of the feather detail in the original capture, but I don't want people to have to work hard to try and see the feather detail. I want it to be more obvious. So I might tone down those highlights a little bit in order to ensure that that feather detail is more obvious. And then perhaps my favorite, the shadows adjustment. Now I can brighten the shadows to open up that shadow detail, or darken the shadows if I want a little bit more dramatic interpretation of the image. What do we want in this case? Anyone?
More detail.
More detail? Who votes for less detail? More contrast? Less shadow detail? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? No. More detail. Everybody's in favor of... Oh, oh, now you're going to speak up. But the point is that we have that flexibility. And with shadow detail in particular, I would say that's where most photographers are going to exercise their creative control. Usually for a typical image, we'll set the brightest pixel as white, the darkest pixel as black. We'll all generally agree about highlight detail because we usually want to preserve highlight detail. It's usually in the shadow detail where we're going to have a difference of opinion. Some people tend to like really dark, deep shadow areas. Some people like to have lots of detail in the shadows. And so that's usually where you're going to see the most difference. But again, it's your picture, presumably. It's up to you how you want to adjust it. There's no one right answer. So you take the image in the direction that you'd like it. The important thing, from my perspective, is that we have this control, that we can exercise control over the overall tonality of the image, and more importantly, based on the way we tend to actually think about the image. We tend to think, oh, well, the image looks great, but I wish I could see some more detail in the shadows. Or it looks great, but the highlights seem a little bit overblown. It looks a little blown out. Even though I know the detail's there, I can't quite see it. And so now we can lighten and darken each of those ranges of tonal values very, very effectively, which I think is rather nice. At any time, by the way, we can see a before version of the image versus an after version of the image just by pressing the backslash key. So it's a good way to just kind of double check, you know, have we really improved the image from the before to the after? So backslash to switch between before and after views for the image in the develop module. Then we'll move on to the presence adjustments. And the first of those is the clarity slider, which I think is rather appropriately named. Would you like to add some clarity to this image? Yes. I was hoping for very strong winds to blow all the haze out of the air. It never happened, and so I have to resort to clarity instead. And so I'll drag that clarity slider over toward the right, and I'll just set it at its maximum value. What do you say? Before, after. Before, after. Did it completely eliminate all of the haze from the photo? Not by a long shot. But did it improve the situation in terms of haze? Yes, and it also enhanced overall contrast for the midtones. I sort of think of this like sharpening, and in fact, it basically is sharpening. For those of you familiar with some of the techniques in Photoshop, we used to be able to sharpen with a really big radius and a really low amount. In other words, across a large distance, but with a really gentle touch. That's almost exactly what clarity is. It's like sharpening, but it's just enhancing mid-tone contrast. It's bringing out detail in the image, which can be really, really nice. But also, we can use a negative value for clarity. This actually tends to work pretty nicely for more ethereal subjects, works nicely for portraits, for flower photographs, for anything that you'd like to kind of soften up or give a more ethereal look to. Negative clarity actually works kind of nice. It gives it sort of a painterly look. But in most cases, I tend to increase the value of clarity. One of the things that I actually really appreciate about clarity is that, unlike with sharpening, you don't generally need to worry about halos appearing. In other words, you can very often maximize the value for clarity and not have any significant problem in the photo. Sometimes it might look a little artificial, a little too good, but by and large, you can be somewhat aggressive with clarity without too much trouble in the photo. Then probably my favorite slider in all of Lightroom, vibrance. Because we all like saturation, right? Who likes saturation? See, now people will raise their hands. We all love saturation. Who's ever gone a little bit overboard with saturation? I mean, I know I never have, but some other photographers do. So vibrance is basically saturation with self-control built in. It's like they were thinking of me when they made it. And one of the other things that's really nice about vibrance, besides the fact that it's got some self-control built in, it's also restricting its effect to protect skin tones. So if we just increase saturation, notice how the skin tones, in this case, they get a little bit too red, orange, kind of weird looking, the color looks off, versus with vibrance, no problem. It's actually protecting skin tones as if by magic. It's actually so simple because we think of skin tones as having so much variation, but when you plot based on RGB values, it's actually a relatively narrow range of color values. It's actually not that huge a range. And so it seems so magical, which is sort of the beauty of it, but it's actually pretty straightforward. The other key thing that vibrance is doing is having a stronger effect on colors that are not very saturated than it's having on colors that are saturated. In other words, unlike with saturation, we don't run the risk of creating, or as much risk anyway, of creating colors that look just totally artificial. It's boosting the saturation for colors that need it and not having too much of an effect on the colors that don't need it because they're already saturated. So it's a really great tool for boosting saturation. It also works pretty nicely for toning down saturation. It has a much more delicate type of effect to it, so I like it for reducing saturation. So then what do we need saturation for if vibrance does such a great job? Sometimes you need a little bit more of a boost. Sometimes you do need to boost the overall colors, even though you're doing it sort of in a linear fashion versus this balanced fashion that vibrance takes. Or you might need to increase vibrance to bring up the colors that need it, but then tone down saturation to help improve the overall look of the image. So I might, for example, bring up vibrance until all the colors look pretty good. Well, except in order to get some of those, the greens, for example, to look pretty good, I had to push vibrance so hard that the blues look a little bit weird. And so now I can take saturation down just a little bit, and I've gotten the benefit of vibrance without overdoing it. So increase vibrance and then tone down saturation just a little very often produces a great, great result. Quite often, though, I find all I need is vibrance. Just boost the vibrance a little bit. I mean, because really we're mostly increasing saturation for our photos, right? How often are we actually going to decrease saturation? It happens, but it's certainly the minority, at least for me. But vibrance, I think, is just a wonderful tool for optimizing that overall color in the image. For essentially, it's color purity, but we can think of it as color intensity. All right, so the other thing we've got here is a black and white option. And if I click black and white, look, the image turns black and white. And if I click color, look, it's in color again. It is magic. But the problem is we don't have very much control, or so it would seem at first glance, because why do I need a black and white button when I could just reduce saturation? Well, it's simple, because I want more control. So I'm going to click black and white, and then I'm going to scroll down, and we can take a look at the black and white set of controls. And now I can adjust the luminance values in the image based on the original color. So for example, what color was the sky? Mostly white, yeah, it's mostly clouds. Let's go with blue. I'll brighten or darken just the blue areas of the photo. So maybe I want some drama in the sky. I'll reduce the value for blue somewhat significantly. Then I also, this area of the carousel.
Red.
You're ruining my joke. This area of the carousel, I don't remember what color it was.
All right, I'm cheating.
But I want to brighten it. So I have two options. I could listen to someone in the audience who knows what color it was. That's actually a third option. I could mess with all of these sliders individually until I finally stumble upon the one that I wanted, which in this case was possibly red. based on our audience survey, or I can let Lightroom do the work for me. I can work directly on the image. See this little bullseye at the top left corner of those black and white adjustments? I'll go ahead and click on that control. That will activate my on-image adjustment, and now I can just point to the image and say, hey Lightroom, you see this area that I don't remember the color of? I want to adjust that area of the image. Just by hovering my mouse over that area, you might notice that the value for red has been highlighted. That's Lightroom telling me this area is red. But I don't even have to then go touch the red slider. Still in this on-image adjustment mode, I can click in that area and drag upward, except it's not working now. I can drag upward, there it goes, to brighten and downward to darken. How amazing is that? So if you're working on an image in Lightroom and you don't have an audience there to remind you of what color an area was, you can work directly on the image. So I can continue clicking and dragging on various areas. I'll go up into the sky, for example, and click and drag downward or upward. And I can just work directly on the image. So I don't have to say, oh, okay, the sky was blue, the carousel was red, this particular car of the Ferris wheel was this color. I can just click within the image with that on-image adjustment capability. When I'm finished, I just click once again to disable it. And of course, I can always go back. I don't know, were there any areas that were green? Yes, we've got some green areas. So I can still go back and adjust all of those sliders, but I can also work directly on the image as I see fit.
That's in 4 and 5?
That was cool.
This is in Lightroom 1 on.
1 on?
Now, that's our black and white adjustment. Let's assume that we still wanted to have color for this image, but we want to be able to control the colors a little bit better. Maybe I just don't like that particular shade of red, for example. Well, I can shift the value of red toward more of an orangey value or toward more of a pinkish value with the hue slider. Or I can increase the saturation of red because it wasn't quite saturated enough. Or I can reduce the saturation for those red areas. And I can also adjust the luminance value for red. So I can brighten or darken just the reds. Now you might be thinking of it in terms of affecting the color in the carousel. It's not exactly what I'm doing. If you pay close attention, when I apply those adjustments, I'll go ahead and shift the hue, for example. Notice that there's a couple of cars, or whatever you call those things hanging off a Ferris wheel. Cars. And there's also part of the frame that has that same reddish sort of color. So I'm not just picking a single object, I'm affecting the image based on color values. So I can adjust the hue, the saturation, or the luminance for an individual range of colors. I can't pick and choose what that range is. In other words, I can't redefine red and say, oh, well, I only want this very, very narrow definition for red rather than Lightroom's definition for red. I can't change the definition of red, but I can change the properties for each of those primary colors. So again, hue, basically shifting the actual value of the color, saturation, changing the intensity of the color, and luminance, or changing the lightness value of the color. I can look at just the individual controls, just hue, just saturation, just luminance, or all. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the histogram so you can see more of those all at once. I can also go to the color option, and then I have the exact same set of controls, but divided based on color. So I've got the hue, saturation, and luminance for red, then the hue, saturation, and luminance for orange, then the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we need both of these? We don't. I guess the Lightroom team just couldn't decide which way to go, so they put both of them in here. And once again, we can filter based on just a specific color value here as well, or we can go to all. Personally, I prefer HSL because I'm usually thinking about the hue, then I'm thinking about the saturation, then I might be thinking about the lightness, but that's just me. And I prefer the all option, not because it actually enables me to work any more efficiently, but mostly it just looks more impressive in case anybody's looking over my shoulder. Or at least that's the theory. Anybody ever get a crooked horizon? Me either. But hypothetically speaking, let's assume that we needed to straighten the horizon and perhaps crop the image a little bit. We'll take a look at the crop tool. The crop tool is actually more of a view in Lightroom than it is a crop tool. And what I mean by that is that we're just looking at the image in a different way because, as with every adjustment that we're applying in Lightroom, it's completely non-destructive. That's pretty cool. So I can go ahead and select an image. I can select that crop tool, and that's on that little toolbar right below where the histogram is. And then I could adjust the crop if I'd like. I can even change the aspect ratio. So if I want to crop to a 5:7 aspect ratio for some reason, I can certainly do that. And perhaps more importantly, I'll set this back to the original, I can also rotate the image. If I click and drag outside the crop box, the image itself will actually rotate. Notice that I get a grid display, and also that I'm rotating the image, not the crop box, so I can actually see what the final result will look like. And even more cool, the corners of the crop box stay inside the image. It is impossible for me to crop with one of those corners outside of the image, so I can't get that funny white triangle that you might have seen if you crop in Photoshop sometimes. Not that I've ever done that, but I heard about a guy who did. If you have a hard time using that drag to rotate to get a horizon perfectly straight, we also have the angle tool here, our little bubble level. So I'll go ahead and click on that tool. You can see my mouse now has that little bubble level attached to it. And then I can click on the horizon and drag across the horizon, or whatever line in the image I want to be perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. And once I'm perfectly aligned with whatever that line may be, I can release the mouse and the image will be rotated accordingly. In this case, I was almost perfect. I was only off by 0.13 degrees. That's pretty impressive for a handheld from a Ferris wheel, right? Plus, don't forget, I intentionally did that so that I would have something to fix for it. So again, usually I focus on that rotation first, get the horizon perfectly straight, or the edge of a building or whatever it might be perfectly vertical, and then I'll fine-tune the overall crop based on whatever I feel is best for the image. All right. We'll take a look at lens correction here. And this actually is a pretty cool set of adjustments. We're going to look at some of the real basic stuff first, and then we'll look at some of the slightly more advanced things, including some new features in Lightroom 5 that I think are pretty excellent. But first, we'll just take a look at the profile-based adjustment. I'm going to switch to the Basic tab here. The Basic tab is new, but these initial checkboxes really are sort of just shortcuts for other adjustments. And so I'm just going to switch directly to the Profile tab. And then I'll enable Profile Correction, and I'm going to set the Setup option to Auto. With that pop-up set to Auto, what's going to happen is that Lightroom will look at the metadata for this image. It will determine what type of camera and lens were used to capture the image, and it will establish a profile, hopefully, for that particular lens and camera combination so that it can apply a lens correction. All I'm doing is compensating for the behavior of the lens. In other words, I'm not making a wide-angle lens suddenly telephoto. I'm just taking out or minimizing the distortion that is inherent with that wide-angle lens. And so if I go to the before and after, you'll see a little bit of that barrel versus pin cushion distortion. You'll see a little bit stronger vignetting correction. So just relatively modest adjustments, again, aimed at compensating for the behavior of the lens. So the really telephoto lens, you're probably going to see virtually no change whatsoever. With a relatively wide-angle lens, you're probably going to see a somewhat significant change, this being significant. We're once again just compensating for the behavior of the lens. And we can actually even sort of override that just a little bit. If I feel like the distortion maybe was too much or not enough, you can see that I can fine-tune the distortion value. Again, a modest adjustment because we're just compensating for the behavior of the lens. And if I decide that vignetting, maybe in this case I feel like the brightening of the image, the corners of the image, in order to compensate for that vignetting effect, maybe it was just a little too much and I want to darken down those edges a little bit. So I'll go ahead and turn that checkbox off and then on. Very modest adjustment, but very often that can be all the adjustment you need to really improve the overall feel of the image. Sometimes an image just looks a little off, you can't even put your finger on it, but something seems not quite right, and that lens correction will often take care of it. But then you run into a situation that's a little bit more challenging. So what's the problem with this image?
Building is bad.
What caused the problem, I guess I should say, with this particular image?
Perspective.
Perspective. What could I have done to fix the problem? Several things. I could have gotten a ladder. I could have gotten a helicopter. I could have jumped really high. Yeah, jetpack would have done it. Yeah, that new wingsuit that guy's got. Yeah, the whole issue here is that my position, this is my fault for not getting up high enough so that I'm perfectly orthogonal to the subject. Because I'm shooting from a low angle, and therefore my angle to the subject is what's causing the problem. This has nothing to do with the lens I was using. If I was using a longer lens, then I've got to get back up further, now I've got less of an angle, etc. So are there other things I could have done? Sure, but really it's a matter of my position relative to the subject. So let's take a look at how we can fix that, including some new options in Lightroom 5. So I'm going to go back to my basic set of options here under lens corrections, and you'll see that we have a new set of upright controls. Currently it's set to off, but I have auto, level, vertical, and full. We'll start off with level. What level does, as the name implies, it just levels the image. In other words, it's just rotating. So think of it as a replacement for that crop that we saw, a very basic crop where we're just straightening the horizon. I'll go ahead and click the level button, and there you have it. Great. Now the base of the building is no longer slanted, and yet we still have this really huge, well, moderately big perspective problem with the image. So I'll switch that back to off. Then we'll take a look at vertical. Vertical applies the same adjustment as level, but now it also applies a vertical perspective correction. So when we have, this is the typical example, a building that seems to be sort of leaning away from us or where the spires seem to be coming together, and we just want to straighten that out. That's the idea behind the vertical option. Lightroom actually analyzes the image and tries to determine how those lines should be adjusted so that we get an image that's both been leveled, so now the base of the building should be perfectly horizontal, and with vertical perspective correction so that hopefully those spires, for example, are parallel to each other and perfectly vertical. Would you say it did a pretty good job? I would say so. And then we have full. Full is level plus vertical plus horizontal perspective correction. So I'll go ahead and click full. Wait, that looks the same as before. Well, that's because I did a good job of standing at the center of the building. I wasn't standing over toward the side. I didn't say perfect job, just a good job. Let's take a look at the difference between vertical and full. You see the difference? There's vertical, there's full. It's subtle, so I didn't make a big mistake. Maybe just a half step one way or the other. But I was off just a little bit. And so by analyzing the lines in the image, Lightroom is able to actually apply a bit of an improvement there. We also have an auto option. And a common misconception is that auto is just causing Lightroom to automatically choose whether to click the level button, the vertical button, or the full button. Not the case. It's actually achieving a three-dimensional transformation of the image completely automatic, irrespective of the other options. What do you say? Pretty nice. I like to talk about how I never use auto adjustments because I want to exercise control. And all of a sudden I'm eating my words because when it comes to the upright adjustments, I find that most of the time the best adjustment is the auto adjustment. Worked out pretty well. Now I can override some of this. I'll go ahead and switch to the manual set of adjustments here. And we have distortion. This, unlike the lens correction distortion, allows us quite a bit of latitude. So I could fine tune if I felt like there was just a little bit of barrel distortion, for example. I could adjust that vertical distortion if I felt like Lightroom didn't get it quite right. Horizontal distortion. So again, that perspective correction for the horizontal. I could rotate if I feel like the level didn't work very well. I can adjust the scale. Now you might be tempted to increase the scale in order to effectively crop the image. The problem is that now you're just zooming in on the center, and that's usually not what you're going to need. If anything, I tend to zoom out, as it were, to reduce the value for scale so I can see more of the image, and then I'll crop hopefully still keeping all or most of the building, but I'll crop based on the way I want to interpret the image. And this is a good example of why it's really important when you have a situation like this that you shoot a little bit wide so you have more room for that cropping. Because you'll notice, for example, that now the top of the image is much wider than the bottom of the image, and so I'm going to have to crop quite a bit to get the edges into the bottom of the photo. I might, in the process, cut something off that I actually wanted. So generally speaking, if you're photographing something where you know perspective is an issue, shoot a bit wider than you think you need to so that you have room to crop later. Now this aspect slider, I don't know why they called it aspect. I mean, I do know why they called it aspect, but it makes it just sort of blend into the other controls, and you might not appreciate how important this is, because this is huge. Very often when you apply perspective correction, what's going to happen to the building? Squat. You're going to make that adjustment, and now the building appears a lot shorter than it really was because of the transformation that's being applied. With aspect, we're able to stretch the building or squish the building, as the case may be. We're changing the aspect ratio of the image, or you might say the aspect ratio of the building, so that we can get it closer to what it really looked like. This, of course, requires that you remember what it really looked like. It might be a good idea to have somebody double check your work. You know, oh, it was a really tall building, and you stretch it way out and it looks funny. But usually you'll need to stretch it a little more vertically when we're dealing with a building. Not always, but generally speaking, you'll find you need to stretch it a little bit vertically. In other words, a positive value for aspect. So a great new slider in Lightroom 5 when it comes to those lens corrections, those perspective corrections. Speaking of lens corrections, chromatic aberration, anyone? I really love the Canon 10 to 22 millimeter lens. It's such a fun, great little lens until I zoom in. I get a lot of chromatic aberration with this lens. It's so much fun on the cameras with the smaller sensor, so you need to use a really, really short lens. The 10 to 22, the short end 10 millimeter behaves as a 16 millimeter on a 7D, for example, the 1.6 cropping factor. You get a lot of chromatic aberration. So you see right along the tower here over on the right side, that sort of reddish halo, and along the top edges, that sort of greenish halo. Chromatic aberration or color fringing. Let's take a look at the adjustments that we have available to us. I'll go back to the basic option here under lens corrections, and you'll see that we have a remove chromatic aberration checkbox. I'll go ahead and turn that on. What do you say? Better. Better. I'll turn that off. So there's our before, there's our after. A lot better, right? I mean, really tremendously better. The problem is, when it comes to chromatic aberration, tremendously better isn't good enough. We really got to eliminate it altogether. Well, fortunately, we do have a little bit more control that we can exercise. I'll switch to the color set of controls here, the color tab underneath lens corrections. Once again, we have that remove chromatic aberration checkbox. The checkbox here on the basic tab is really just a shortcut to this other checkbox. So you can turn it on or off in either place. They both reflect each other. But now we have these defringe options. We can defringe for magenta or for green. Well, this looks magenta, so let's defringe the magenta. Oh, there we go. And let's defringe the green. That didn't quite do it. Well, let's just expand the range of colors so that we're saying, you know, green is not just green, it's also aqua and cyan and blue and whatever. There, now the chromatic aberration, the color fringing has completely disappeared, hasn't it? I mean, so is some of the color from the sky, but the color fringing did disappear. And this is sort of the catch-22. When you're applying these adjustments, you know, we have a tendency, I think, or at least I sometimes have a tendency to be a little bit heavy-handed with the adjustments. And you, oh, this is a bad thing, so I'm going to push really strong to get rid of it. And then you make some other problem in the image. So you have to be very, very careful when you're applying this adjustment. And specifically, when we're determining the range of colors to be affected, we need to be very, very careful. I can expand the range of colors that are going to be defined as that purple fringing, for example, but I need to be extremely careful to make sure that I don't create more problems than I solve. And I also want to be sure to check multiple areas of the photo, because sometimes you'll fix it in one place only to find that it got worse in another place. So here we have a little bit too much of that green fringing, and so I might see if I can expand this range just a tiny bit, etc. So the point is that I'll want to check very carefully to make sure. There again, you see I'm getting a little too far into the sky, so I'll have to back off on that range and probably back off on this range, etc. So we need to check multiple areas of the image very, very carefully, looking to make sure that we've minimized the problematic fringing, but not eliminated something that's not really fringing. So for example, the sky around that tower for the bridge, we obviously don't want to correct that to the point that it's even worse than what we started with. Noise. Now, I never have noise in my photos, which is why I took a test shot at 6400 ISO so that I could simulate noise. How many of you don't believe all these commercials or advertisements that talk about how you can shoot at like 5 million ISO and still have noise-free images? Am I the only one that hasn't quite had that experience in the real world? Yeah. And the other thing, even if you've got a camera that behaves really, really well when it comes to high ISO settings, we also develop a lot of noise in our images based on heat buildup, long exposures, etc. So there's all sorts of issues that can lead to noise, even if you've got a camera that performs great when it comes to high ISO. But let's go ahead and zoom in and, oh, actually, I mean, on a color noise standpoint, we're actually in pretty good shape, wouldn't you say? I don't see any color noise, do you? No, you don't. I mean, maybe the tiniest little hint, but not perceivable to the naked eye. Now, this is actually one of the things I try to really underscore in terms of not getting the real story about your pictures. And I find a lot of photographers are surprised at just how much noise they're getting in their cameras. Because you know what Lightroom's doing? It's trying to make you feel better. It's trying to be helpful. By default, Lightroom applies color noise reduction to every single image you work on, which means by default, you have no clue how bad your camera is performing. So if we get back up into the noise reduction adjustments here, you'll see color noise, the value is set to 25. I'm going to turn detail down to nothing to begin with, and I'm going to take, oh boy. Now we've got color noise. I mean, before maybe there was some degree of ambiguity, but now there's clearly a problem. Let's make it worse by zooming in. One of the worst things you can ever do when it comes to your self-esteem as a photographer is zoom in. So you zoom in, look at all that noise that we didn't even know was there, because by default Lightroom is applying a moderate amount of color noise reduction. So you're not really getting a true picture of how your images are coming out of the camera. The thing about noise reduction, you notice they call it noise reduction, not noise elimination. You can't get rid of it. I mean, you can, but you won't like it. Noise reduction is all about compromise. We got the noise in the first place usually through compromise, right? Like we left our tripod in the hotel room, and now we're shooting handheld, so I got to crank up the ISO or I'm not going to be able to get the shot. It's compromise. We end up with noise. But reducing noise is also compromise. You can't just get rid of it altogether. With color noise reduction, we have a little bit more flexibility. If I really crank up that color noise reduction, the color noise disappears. Can you see a little bit of color fringing? Let me go back to a 1:1 setting here. It might be a little more obvious. A little bit of a color halo type of effect here. And notice how we've lost saturation. But this corner it's pretty obvious in. We've lost a lot of saturation in the image. And that's because color noise reduction is a process of averaging out color values. you know, taking that really, really red pixel and that really, really green pixel and sort of averaging them together so that we end up with something that's hopefully relatively neutral. But in the process, we're also averaging out the good color in the image. And so we start to run into a problem where we get these weird kind of bleeding colors within the photo, and perhaps even more problematic is this loss of saturation in certain areas. So we need to use the minimum amount of noise reduction that still produces a good result. Now that's a little bit tricky. I'm going to zoom back in here for a second. It's a little bit tricky when it comes to color noise reduction because you do have to push it a little further than you might otherwise expect, at least at first glance. So there's really problematic color noise. We've got at the pixel level all sorts of wild variations. But if I increase just a little bit, those pixels sort of disappear, except now they've turned into these blobs of color. So I can't just do it a tiny little bit. I have to push it a little bit, but I want to be careful not to push it too far. So I'll go just to the point where all that color seems to disappear. And then to help compensate a little, I can bring up the detail. It's sort of like sharpening just a little bit, but it's more like mitigating the noise reduction in certain areas, which means if I increase detail too much, I'm going to start seeing noise coming right back through. So once again, only enough to improve the image without creating new artifacts. That's not too bad. Compromise. I mean, you know, it wasn't all that bad. What about luminance noise reduction? Oh, man. Yeah, there we go. No more noise. In fact, not much of anything. Boy, look at that. Not a single speck of noise. I defy you to find any noise or detail in the entire photo. Yeah. I mean, you know, it is sort of an interesting, like, painterly kind of a thing. You try to tell yourself. Yeah, so luminance noise is the really problematic one, and this is where compromise really comes into play. I encourage you to come to terms with noise as film grain. It's okay. It's organic or something. Because especially with luminance noise reduction, you really have to be pretty modest. Even here, you can see a pretty significant loss of sharpness, and we still haven't gotten rid of all that luminance noise. So I'd probably end up right about there, give or take. It's enough to tone down that luminance noise, not eliminate it, but it's also not so much that I start to lose the greater detail within the photo. Again, noise is all about compromise. If I didn't want this noise, I shouldn't have shot the image at 6400 ISO. Then I'd have motion blur to deal with instead, right? So it's definitely about compromise, and you need to just be modest in your noise reduction approach. You have to be modest in the adjustment that you apply there, because otherwise, frankly, you'll have a bigger problem than the noise in the first place. All right. Dust spots, anyone on your image sensor? No, not at all. No. I had to actually painstakingly add some specs onto my sensor to take a picture so that I could demonstrate for you how you would just claim that they're all birds flying far, far away. Yeah, so here we have some dust spots. Can you see a lot of those dust spots? Mm-hmm. How many do you see?
3, 4.
It might be the projector screen. We just don't know.
2, 3.
I'm hearing up to 4 is the highest number I'm seeing.
4. Wait, 1, 2, 3.
Let's go ahead and switch to the spot removal tool. No, it's,
1, 2.
no, there's one in every crowd. Now somebody's just like 12, 13, 18, 27, making up numbers. There's only 4. Actually, there's only 3. One of them is a bird. How about now?
Wow.
Is that cool or what? How did I do that? It's magic. Visualize spots. Boy, there's an appropriately named checkbox.
Where was it?
If ever there was one. This is brand new in Lightroom 5. It is so cool as far as basic image cleanup. So what was the biggest number? Now, was somebody making up, I heard 6, 7, 8 or something? You really was? All right. But there's a lot more than 6, 7, or 8, aren't there? How many? Now what do we count? Probably a couple dozen? I don't even know. So now we find suddenly a lot of dust spots. So with this visualize spots checkbox, huge benefit in terms of being able to find those spots. And here's the thing, if you couldn't find it with your eyes, do you think it's really necessary to clean it up? Yeah. At first glance, you're going to think, oh no, if I can't see it.
Does it depend on how big?
Until you print it. And then all of a sudden you've got a little bit of an issue on your hands, or until you increase contrast, or until you darken up the shadow, or so you start applying other adjustments, and it's like, I've cleaned up my image, and now I go make an adjustment. Oh, man, now I brightened up the shadows, and I can see more dust. Urgh. So very, very helpful. We also have a slider here. Here's the funny thing. I pretty much always want the slider way over at the far right. I encourage you to drag it through and check to see if you discover any other spots elsewhere. But in my experience, in almost every single situation, I want it all the way over to the right because that's where I can see the most spots. And part of it's just based on the nature of when spots appear. They're of course going to be most prominent in the brightest areas of the photo, etc. Not because that's the only area of your sensor that has spots, but in the darker areas they just get lost in the clutter because usually we'll see the spots up in the sky because it's a nice even toned, relatively bright area, and we won't see the spots down below in the foreground because there's all sorts of stuff down there. Well, that's all well and good. Let's talk for a moment, though, before we revisit visualize spots, about that spot healing brush tool, or the spot removal tool, as it's called in Lightroom. It's the same, essentially, as a spot healing brush, sort of, in Photoshop. The only major drawback is that it does not have the content-aware technology that Photoshop includes, but otherwise, it's actually pretty darn close. We have the clone versus heal option. I always leave it on heal. Always. Well, not always, but always. Because the only time I set it to clone is when I'm trying to demonstrate why I always leave it on heal. So with Lightroom, pretty much never a situation where I need to use clone versus heal. In Photoshop, sometimes I need to build up an adjustment and first clone it and then heal it. In Lightroom, that tends not to be the case. The size and opacity I don't really worry about. Opacity, I always want to get rid of the blemish completely. I don't just want to tone down the dust spot, I want it gone. And size, I'll adjust on the fly while I'm working on the image. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit so we can see a little more clearly. Oh look, there's a dust spot. And so I can use the left and right square bracket keys to adjust the brush size. I don't even really need to, as we'll see in a moment, but I can. And then I simply click to eliminate the dust spot. Because when I click, I'm telling Lightroom, I want you to clean up this area, and Lightroom will look for an area that seems to be an appropriate replacement for that area. So I'm going to zoom out, and then I will move that little dust spot correction into, I'm going to make it larger first, move it into another area, and look, I can put wave texture up into the sky if I want to. The point is that I can move the source and destination. I can resize the circle or move them around within the image so that I can say, replace this dust spot with this texture. In this case, obviously, it did a really good job in the first place. And because I have that heal option set, it's automatically blending in to match that destination area. I also have a tool overlay setting down here at the bottom. I set that to auto. We can choose auto, always, selected, never. I leave it on auto so that when my mouse is over the image, I see those little circles and the arrows saying I'm cleaning up from here to here. But when I move my mouse off the image, I see just the image, so I'm not distracted by all those dust spots. Now remember that visualize spots option? How could we forget? It was so amazing. We're going to be talking about that all night. So I'm going to turn on visualize spots again. Oh man, I thought my work was done. Now look at that. I can actually work with the spot removal tool while I'm in visualize spots mode. So I'll click on that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. This could take all day. I should have cleaned my sensor, etc., etc., etc. But what about this little area here? I'm going to turn off visualize spots for a moment, and we'll zoom in right there. You can kind of barely see it, but it's not a spot, it's a line. Some thread, yeah, I'm sure. Probably the fiber from my camel hair brush that I was using to clean the sensor got left behind. I got this little thread of some sort. Well, gosh, I really hate to use a circular area. It would have to be about, oh, that big in order to clean up that area. Don't you wish that you could just paint a brush stroke when cleaning up the image like you could do in Photoshop? You mean like that? Now in Lightroom 5, we can actually, there's our tool. In Lightroom 5, we can actually paint areas rather than only working with circles. So just click and drag to paint. I'm going to zoom out and do some silly adjustments here just to show you a couple other things. If I click, let's make this brush a little bit larger so you can see it better. If I hold the Shift key and click and drag to the right and left, I can make a horizontal cleanup area. Obviously, that's going to create a silly result. If I click with the Shift key held down and drag up or down, I'm constrained to a vertical line. So holding the Shift key, I can click and drag, and whichever direction I drag will determine whether it's horizontal or vertical, but I'm now locked into a horizontal versus vertical area of cleanup. So if I need to clean up an area right along the horizon, for example, I can just paint in that manner. I'm going to undo those last couple of steps and just, in fact, I'm going to reset the image just so that we can see without all the clutter there. The other option is that I can click over here. In fact, let's do it on the horizon just because it'll be a little more obvious. I'll click at the left edge of the horizon. But wait, I actually wanted to paint straight across the horizon to clean up the horizon. No problem. I can come over to the other edge of the horizon, hold the Shift key, and click again, and I've joined those two spots, as it were, into a straight line. So now I've cleaned up the horizon. Like that makes any sense, right? But the point is that I can either click and drag with the Shift key to paint a perfectly horizontal or vertical line, or I can click and then Shift click, and it doesn't have to be perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical. It can also be, as in this case, you see it should pop up there in a moment, it could be at a diagonal line, it could be any line I want if I want to connect via a straight line. Obviously, for visual purposes, I'm just kind of randomly clicking all over the image so that you can see the effect. But if you had, for example, a power line going across the sky, you could click at one end of it and then Shift click at the other end of it, and it'll clean it up. Now, the only drawback relative to Photoshop in this respect is that these areas, the source and destination, are going to be the exact same shape. With Content Aware in Photoshop, it's able to actually take bits and pieces of the image from all over and assemble them into one composite cleanup, which is very impressive. In Lightroom, we don't have that luxury, so it's a source area and a destination area with the exact same shape. I can move them around relative to each other, but the actual shape is going to remain the same. So that can be a little bit of a limiting factor, and it means that you might need to paint in various areas and sort of build up a correction over the course of multiple brush strokes. But still, pretty darn impressive in terms of both being able to paint in various areas in various ways and also utilizing that visualize spots. Let's see what a mess we've made of it now. Using that visualize spots option so that we can see exactly where in the image we might have missed a spot, which I think is just huge. I think the visualize spots checkbox all by itself is worth the upgrade from 4 to 5, as far as I'm concerned. Not that I have a dirty sensor or anything, but still. Yes, there are the spots in Paris. So we'll take a look at the gradient adjustment here. Very simple, kind of like a graduated neutral density filter, except we're not just limited to tonal adjustments, to density adjustments. We can actually apply a variety of adjustments. I'll go ahead and choose that gradient option, and then I'll click and drag in the image to define the gradient that I want to create. So for example, adjusting the sky, but having it gradually taper off down to the bottom of the image. And then you'll see that I have a subset of controls here, so I can adjust the exposure of the sky, and I can adjust the contrast of the sky, and I can adjust clarity, and we'll boost saturation, and whatever it is that I want to apply as an adjustment. And I can have that adjustment gradually taper off. And the cool thing here is that it's non-destructive, of course, as with all of the adjustments in Lightroom, and I can bounce back and forth between the adjustment and that gradient. So I'll come back over here, maybe I'll reposition the gradient either higher or lower, or I'll grab that top bar and maybe adjust the bottom bar as well and make a narrower transition from one area to the other. I could even rotate that gradient if I needed to. etc. So you get the idea there. We can fine-tune the shape of that gradient and always come back and fine-tune the overall effect that we're applying. So adjust my controls over on the right side and just keep going back and forth as I see fit. And in fact, I can even click this new option here and then add an additional gradient. So now I have a vertical gradient going top to bottom and then a horizontal gradient going left to right. So for example, I had a little bit too much light coming in from the right. Maybe the sun was near the edge of the frame, so we got this kind of hot spot over on one side. I could adjust that individually. So I can adjust the size and the angle, etc., and then fine tune the adjustment, whatever the case may be. My favorite part of the whole thing now? Because I only made a second gradient to show you that it could be done. Most of the time I only need one gradient. So now I need to get rid of the other gradient. And this brings us to one of my favorite features in all of Lightroom. If we want to delete one of these options, first I have to select the edit pin that I want to delete. So I could click on that little button in order to select one or the other, and then keep an eye on this edit pin right there. And I'm going to press delete. You ready? Isn't that cool? Favorite feature in all of Lightroom. Now, related to the gradient filter is the brand new radial filter. Same concept, different shape. Gradient filter is just a linear adjustment. We're affecting, for example, the top more than the bottom with a gradual transition, or the left versus the right, or whatever we want. Now, with the radial filter, we can create an ellipse. So we can make it circular, we can make any shape we want. I can move it around within the image. So I've just defined an ellipse. I can move my mouse outside. Oops, I can move my mouse outside. There we go. Right there, and rotate that ellipse. I can grab the handles and make it, skinnier, etc. We'll go ahead and just make it that shape, just for fun. But if I scroll down, notice I can also invert the mask. So I can affect the center of the image versus the edges of the image. I can adjust the feathering. Do I want no feathering at all, or lots of feathering, or maybe somewhere in between? And then, of course, as we've already seen with the gradient adjustment, I can change the effect that I'm applying. So, just apply some slightly dramatic adjustments here so we can see the effect. Adjust that feathering, etc. So you get the idea here. We're able to define an elliptical shape and then adjust a series of settings for either inside that elliptical shape or outside the elliptical shape as we see fit, with a degree of transition or feathering in between. So essentially the exact same thing as a gradient, just in an elliptical shape as opposed to a linear shape. And then perhaps arguably the most powerful of all is the adjustment brush. The basic concept here is pretty straightforward. I can select that adjustment brush tool. I can come out into the image. You'll notice at the moment I have a -2 stops of exposure compensation essentially, and a little brightening of the highlights. I can then just paint that adjustment into the image. There we go, just like that. The problem is I'm not very good at painting inside the lines. But you can see that I'm able to paint an adjustment into a specific area of the image. I can turn on the Show Selected Mask overlay so that I can see this rubylith overlay, this red overlay on top of the area that's being affected. Pretty cool, as long as the area you're working on isn't red. Then it's a little bit of a challenge. I'll go ahead and turn that off though. Generally speaking, I don't worry about the rubylith so much as applying an exaggerated adjustment so that I can see where I've affected versus not affected the image. I'll usually start off with an exaggerated adjustment, and then I'll fine-tune where I'm affecting the image, and then I'll come back and refine my adjustments. I'm going to collapse that histogram so we can see the rest of the controls here. I have an A brush, a B brush, and an erase brush. A and B are really just for your convenience. So, for example, you can have a soft edge brush as A and a hard edge brush as B, and you can switch back and forth between them instead of moving a slider back and forth. So there's not any magic to it, it's just 2 presets and you can change the settings for each as you see fit. And then there's the erase brush. I'll go ahead and come in and erase along the sky there. Well, along the horizon, I guess I should say. I'll add a little more feathering and maybe make it just a little bit larger, maybe something like that. And I'll try, and I'll try, and I'll try. I'll go back to the A brush and I'll try to paint a little bit more carefully. maybe with a little bit smaller brush, and do something like that. But the thing to keep in mind here is that what are the odds that I'm going to apply this strong an adjustment? I hope not very strong odds. I hope that most of my adjustments are going to be relatively modest. And if that's the case, the reality is that you don't have to necessarily be all that perfect in your painting. With a feathered brush, you can apply that adjustment and let it taper off. Sort of like with the gradient filter, we're able to have the adjustment taper off, and so it's not such a big deal if I painted a little bit outside the lines. But what if you decide that it is important to get it exactly right? For example, if I want to affect the red car here, I'm going to go ahead and click the New option to define a new area that I want to affect. And then I'm going to paint an adjustment into just the car. But in this case, I want Lightroom to do the work for me as far as painting inside the lines. So I'm going to turn on the Auto Mask option. With Auto Mask on, I'm basically going to focus my energy on defining the area of transition between the object I'm trying to affect, or the area I'm trying to affect, and the rest of the image. And when I'm doing that, what I need to make sure to do is keep that crosshair, that little plus you see at the center of my brush, must remain inside the area that I want to adjust. The inner circle of that brush must overlap the area I want to affect and the area I don't want to affect, so that transition. In other words, that crosshair stays inside the car at all times, and the circle covers the division between the car, the edge of the car, and the rest of the scene. So I'll go ahead and click and drag, and again, keeping that crosshair inside the car, but making sure that the circle overlaps the edge of the car versus the rest of the image. You can see with that exaggerated darkening effect that I've applied, it's relatively easy to see which areas I've not quite gotten perfect yet, etc. We'll call that good enough for now. Once I've defined that outer boundary, then I'll turn off Auto Mask, and I'll come back in here and clean up the rest of it. I'll reduce that feathering a little bit so that we're able to work with a little bit more precision, and I'll get the rest of the car covered. So I'm going to use the Auto Mask option to define the edge, and then I'll turn off Auto Mask and clean up the rest of it. And then, of course, once I've defined that area, and I think it's looking pretty good, now I can go back and change whatever the adjustment was. So maybe I wanted to, I don't know, make the car a different color, and I wanted to reduce the saturation, whatever the case may be. The point is that I can focus my adjustments on a specific area of the photo. And I can take advantage of that auto masking option so that I'm able to define a very crisp area. Pretty cool. But the kicker is, I hardly ever need it. Because usually I'm applying a relatively modest adjustment, and so I can use that feathered brush to just paint roughly into that area without too much concern. But in situations where you need a rather precise adjustment in a specific area, that auto mask option is pretty invaluable. All right, so now that we have, well, now that we have theoretically optimized our images, shall we share some images? Yes. So we're going to take a look at two quick options here that I think are pretty cool. Who's heard of Facebook? Anybody? Two of you? So we're going to look at Facebook, but first we're going to look at email. I used to be able to make the joke that, I have to use email because my mom's not on Facebook. Except now my mom's on Facebook. So, so I'm going to go back to the library module in this case because we'll look at a few things over there. For starters, how do we email a photo? It's simple. We select a photo or multiple photos. We go to the File menu. We choose Email Photo. How easy is that? So I'm going to select Email Photo from the File menu. That will bring up an email to Mom. Oops. Lynn Bridge. And then I can say, hi, Mom. The class loves me. Well, you have to embellish a little for Mom. Yeah. Here's a picture. You get the idea. Notice that the selected file, in this case just one image, is included as an attachment. How big an image shall we make it? Small, medium, large, full size? No, my mom's operating on a really slow internet connection. She lives out in the woods. So I'm going to use the medium option. I can also define my own preset if I'd like, specify a specific size, a quality setting, etc. We can also choose who it's coming from. Well, this isn't really who it's coming from. It's coming from you, of course, but more your email account. So if you have, for example, I'm on a Macintosh, I have the Apple Mail application installed, I could simply choose Apple Mail. I've created a preset for, I think it's my Gmail account, but I can also go to the email account manager and I can specify all of my settings that I want to use for that particular email account. And if I go ahead and click the add option here, you'll see that it supports AOL, Gmail, etc. You know, most of the major options are available here. And then you simply click the send button and the email gets sent. But of course, I'm not really going to send this email to my mom because that's not even her real email address. So I'll just go ahead and click cancel. What about Facebook though? Facebook's pretty common. I know only like 3 of you claim to be on Facebook, but I know that 90% of you are on Facebook because it must be true because like the whole planet's on Facebook. And there are also a variety of other options. So Facebook is just the one that I've configured and that I use most often, but you can also utilize Flickr, SmugMug, Adobe Revel as an Adobe-based file sharing application, as it were, or service. What are the other ones? There's others as well. Oh, the new one that Adobe acquired, Behance, which is sort of a sharing site. So you've got these options that are available. And basically all you need to do is essentially let Lightroom know how to log into your Facebook account. Sounds a little scary, doesn't it? I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and click Setup. So over on the left panel, we're in the Library module once again. Over on the left panel, after having selected, for example, a photo that I'd like to share via Facebook, I go over to Publish Services on that left panel, and you'll notice that Facebook has not yet been set up for actually sharing photos directly from Lightroom. I'm going to set it up. So I'll go ahead and click the Setup button, and you'll find out that actually I had already set up an account here, and so Facebook is already configured. If it was not, I could click this Authorize on Facebook button. In my case, I'm just using a different catalog, but the information is already stored on my computer because I've already done this in a previous catalog. But you could also just click Authorize on Facebook. That'll bring up a browser window where you sign into your Facebook account. The same basic process applies to all of these. So if you're using Flickr, for example, where, what is it now? You've got, is it unlimited? It's a terabyte, right? Yeah, a terabyte of storage. Like I'm going to upload my whole catalog just to try it out. You know, Behance is a new one, Adobe Revel. So there's a bunch of these, and the basic process is the same, that you need to give Lightroom permission to access your account. So mine's already set up. I'm already authorized. I'll go ahead and click Save. And now, underneath Facebook, you can see that I have a Publish service under Facebook for timeline photos. I could set up a separate album. There's all sorts of settings I could use here, but I'll just leave this set at the default. And now, that was a one-time setup. Facebook is ready for me to use in this Lightroom catalog. So I'll take this image of the Brooklyn Bridge and I'll drag and drop over to timeline photos. I didn't do it yet. That was me telling Lightroom I'd like to publish this image, but I'm not actually going to publish it. I could right-click and choose Publish Now, but instead I'm going to click on that. It's basically like a collection. I'm going to switch to the grid view. And you'll see a list of photos that have already been published, which in this case is none because this is a brand new catalog created exclusively for your benefit. So I've not yet published any images from this particular Lightroom catalog, but I'm about to. So here is the one image in this case that is ready to publish. So I'll go ahead and click the Publish button up at the top right. Lightroom will process the image. Lightroom will call Facebook. No. Lightroom will upload my image to Facebook, and eventually the task will be completed. So now, theoretically, my image, this Brooklyn Bridge shot, is on Facebook. Let's go take a look. We won't look at the news. And there it is. This is where you ooh and ah and cheer wildly for the TV cameras. So now we have to wait and see how long is it going to take for somebody to like it. Wait, somebody liked it. I was about to like it myself, but somebody else did. Now let's see how long it takes for somebody to comment on it. You got to fill time somehow. Come on. And still only one like? Fine. We'll comment on this photo ourselves. Still nothing. Oh, man. So disappointing. We'll go back to Lightroom. We'll forget about Facebook for a moment. Actually, not really. Over on the right panel, check this out. I love this. Scroll down. No comments. This is the comments section for this photo in my Facebook publish service. Like count, 0. It's a lie. Somebody has already liked this photo. All I have to do is click the refresh button here because, you know, Lightroom's got better things to do than sit there and constantly monitor my Facebook account, right? But if I click that refresh button, give it a moment, it's up to 2 likes. Did I say 2? I mean 3. Still no comments. Now we're getting desperate, right? This is where the ego thing starts to set in. Now we got comment on our own. Well, check this. I'm going to go over here. Who wants to say something about this photo? Nobody. Too much chromatic aberration, he says. The group at B&H is having a great time. I hope. I often wonder what people who are really friends with me on Facebook and they see all these things, why is he commenting on his own picture? I hope they know that it's just this. Now I'm going to go refresh and look. In Lightroom, I'm able to see the comments that had been applied via Facebook. Now, if I don't even know what the problem is. Oh, it's 5:30. Everybody's off work. So nobody's on Facebook anymore. But if a real person, now how come one of you hasn't popped open your iPad and gone and commented on this photo by now? It's not.
There's no signal.
There's no signal. Oh yeah, you probably have no signal. Okay, we'll give you a pass on that. Because then we could be like virtual chatting with only a 30-second delay between. Now, but the point is that we've got these comments and the likes on Facebook, and we can interact directly within Lightroom. Why is this so cool? Actually, I think this is really cool because, number one, why do we take pictures? Mostly for ourselves for selfish reasons, but a little bit because we want to share our vision with somebody else. And if you're on Facebook, for example, or Flickr, or Adobe Revel, or any of these other photo sharing services, don't you want to kind of see what people say about your photos, and maybe you want to interact with them and reply to their comments, etc. And one of the things that I think is so cool here is that we can actually do all of that right here within Lightroom. And so I can look at my actual image within Lightroom. What if somebody were to say, oh, Tim, that's really cool. I see you got a starburst effect on the lights on the Brooklyn Bridge. What were your exposure settings to accomplish that? Well, if I'm in Facebook, I don't know what that is because Facebook strips out all the metadata so people can steal my pictures. But here in Lightroom, I can see, look, right up here, ISO 400, 24mm, f22, 30-second exposure. So if someone were to comment and ask that question, I could look right here within Lightroom and actually see the information and type that information directly, copy and paste values, whatever the case may be. So it allows us to interact with, in this case, Facebook, but any of these other photo sharing services as well, so that we're doing it all from within one place, where our photos actually live. Let's check that like status. Oh, so disappointing. Still only 3 likes. All right, enough of that fun. As fun as it has been, we should move on to some other photos and some other methods of sharing. And as I mentioned when we got started here, one of the cool things about working with the various sharing modules in Lightroom is that once you know how to use one of them, you essentially know how to use all of them. There are some specifics related to each one that are a little bit unique, but by and large, when you know how to use one of the sharing modules, you know how to use them all because they're structured essentially the same. So let's take a look at a relatively simple example. I should start with the print module. I'll go ahead and choose the print module, and it's pretty straightforward. Let's look at this from just a very high level. I already know what I'm doing, and so I'm just going to print an image. I want to print an 8x10. Simple. go to the print module, select an image, choose a template, and click print. Now, is it always exactly that easy? Not necessarily, because we do want to take a look at the settings. For example, making sure that I have an appropriate printer profile established. So here, for example, I have a printer profile established for a particular type of paper on a particular printer, but guess what? That's sticky. So now that I've established that, I literally can select an image, select a template, and choose print. Amazing. Oh wait, I actually want to print this image, and this image, and this image. So I can select multiple images. I'm currently set to print the selected photos. I could print all film strip photos, which is what, 29 images. That's a lot of 8x10s. Or just the flagged photos if I'm using pick flags. But generally speaking, I'll work with that selected photos option. And so now I'm actually going to end up with 3 prints because I've selected 3 images, and I've selected my 8x10 template, and you'll notice at the bottom right corner that I get an indication 1 of 3. So there's page 1 of 3, and here's page 2 of 3 if I select that specific image. There's page 3 of 3. Well, what happens if I choose a template where we have multiple images on the page? Now I can get 2 5x7s of each of these images, but what if I don't actually want multiple copies of each image? What if I actually want to print 4 images, 2 up? Well, I could take a look and see, can I find a particular template over on the left side that suits my specific needs? If I can't, then I can come over to the right panel and fine-tune the specific settings for the specific template that I've selected. So I start off by selecting a template that seems to be the closest match for what I'm trying to accomplish, and then I'll fine-tune. So let's take a look at those settings just for the sake of understanding a little bit better. I can choose whether or not I want to zoom to fill. In other words, do I want the image to be cropped, perhaps just a little bit, but cropped to fit the aspect ratio of the cell size that I've defined? Do I want it rotated to fit so that it fits in the available space? Do I want a photo border? In this case, I've got an 11-point photo border, an inner stroke of 0.2 points. That sounds weird. That's black. Do I want to display the rulers, the grid, and the guides? Those are non-printable, so that's just for layout assistance. So for example, I could turn off those rulers if I didn't want them or what have you. For the packages, I can add cells. So I can say, oh, I also want, a couple wallet size, and I want another 5x7, and I want a 4x6, and an 8x10, and whatever. You get the idea. I can very quickly and easily add to that package, or I can very quickly choose a different template to get rid of all those changes. I can change the size of the selected cell. So if I want to change this particular cell to be some other size, 4x6 instead of 5x7 or what have you. I can change the page background color if I want to waste a lot of ink on the background of the image. I can add a watermark. I generally would not do this for print, but it is an option that's available to you if you want to add essentially your copyright information or your credit line, your website address, what have you. Generally speaking, if I'm going to mark a print in that way, I would sign it as opposed to putting a visible watermark, but it is an option that's available. We'll take a look at the watermarking a little bit later. And then we have our output settings. So if we wanted to print, as I said before, a single image, then we need to use a template, for example, one of these, that is set to not repeat 1 photo per page. So do we want to have 1 image, are we talking about a picture package, or do we want to have multiple images just ganged up on a single sheet, making the most use of the paper? And here actually is a more dramatic example, by the way, of that zoom to fill. Do we want the image cropped to fit the cell size, or do we want to see the entire image just fitting inside of that cell? So for the most part, pretty self-explanatory and pretty straightforward. We're choosing the images, choosing the template, and then fine-tuning as needed based on our particular issue. We also have a little bit more flexibility, however. Let's take a look at, we'll do like maybe that one. Custom. This is cool. Well, these are verticals, so maybe we should find a vertical. There's a vertical, and we'll drag that into this cell. And maybe we'll put this one into that cell. And maybe we'll, ooh, look, a whale tail. We'll put that into that cell. Oh, the whale tail got cut off. But that's okay, because I can drag the cell around, I can drag the image around, I can zoom in on the image.
Take the one next to it.
This, oh, this one? You like that one better?
Yeah, that'll fit in there.
That does fit better. Look at that, brilliant. We can even, let's see, let's find, ooh, this is a nice texture. We'll put this in the background. Ooh. Okay, now it's getting a little messy. But I can move these around. I can resize these cells. I've got all sorts of flexibility in terms of how I'm going to lay out the page. And notice I can overlap these. So I'm essentially creating a montage of these images. I'm not just slapping a bunch of images on a printed page. Now I'm actually creating essentially a pretty printing. You might think of this sort of like a page that would appear in a book. So if you're making your own custom album pages, for example. Or perhaps even better, or at least interesting, in addition to being able to print our images from the print module, that's sort of obvious, we can also print to a JPEG. And so whatever layout we might choose, now obviously for a JPEG, you know, in this case it's, well, I've made sort of a mess of this page, but we'll pretend like it's nice. I can print to, instead of the printer, I can choose JPEG file. I can set the quality setting, I can set sharpening if I'd like, I can set the resolution, etc. I'll convert to sRGB, for example, and then I can print to file, and I can save that file, give it a name, etc., and I will end up with a JPEG image that matches the exact layout that I created via the print module. This can be helpful if you need to send the file to someone else to be printed, but it's also kind of cool just in terms of being able to share your images in the context of a print layout. So something like this, which granted I've kind of just slapped this together as a silly example, but we can take a layout like this and make it actually look really nice where we've got multiple images that we're sharing and then save it as a JPEG that we send off to someone else. Obviously it would be a little bit more interesting if we filled the page with that last image, set the margins to 0 and all that good stuff. But you get the idea. Well, that's probably the most simple approach to sharing our images, at least in the context of the level of difficulty, you might say, in terms of preparing that output. But what about some of the other options? Well, let's take a look at the slideshow option. And here again, super simple. Here, notice that the default is all film strip photos, because usually if you're going to play a slideshow, you would have already selected a particular folder or a particular collection, or you would have set a filter based on star ratings or whatever the case may be. And so the default here is all film strip photos. And we'll go with the crop to fill option. How's that? Choose a template and then hit play. Slides 20 and 24 needed some extra work, apparently. There we go. I don't know what the settings were. Probably it's like 5 seconds. I mean, we'll take a look in a moment and see what the settings are. But how simple is that? Choose the images via the library module, for example, so that the film strip is populated with the images that we want to present as our slideshow. Choose a template. Click the play button. But wait, there's more. We still have a variety of options available over on the right panel. So I'm going to switch to a vertical image just so we can see the effect of this zoom to fill. So zoom to fill, you see the image is essentially just cropped. I can drag it around if I want a particular area of the photo to be revealed, but I can also turn off the zoom to fill frame option so that I'm always seeing the entire image. I can add a border around the images if I'd like. I can cast a shadow, which in this case is not visible because my background is currently black. I can show the guides, and that really is just for my purposes in laying out the show, but also in terms of changing the overall layout of the show. So I can unlink these, for example, and I can have the images all appear over on the right-hand side by increasing the padding, as it were, over on the left side. So now as I switch between these images, you'll see the effect. I'll go ahead and relink these though and set those all back to their maximum values. We can add our identity plate as an overlay. So if you've added an identity plate, either text or image, that is essentially your logo as it were, you can add that. We'll go ahead and add watermarking here. I'll turn on watermarking, then I'll click the pop-up. I don't have any watermarks created, but I can fix that really quickly. I'll choose Edit Watermarks and come into the watermark editor, and I'll just put timgray.com. Which corner shall we put that in? Anyone?
Upper right.
Upper right, he says. Shall we bring it inside the image a little more? Inset it into the image a little bit, maybe?
Yeah.
Just a smidge? And opacity, maybe we'll reduce the opacity a little bit. Drop shadow, I mean, everything needs drop shadow, right? You can change the font, you can make it, bold, etc. You get the idea. We're able to change all the settings in terms of the position, the inset amount, the specific font, the font size, etc. And then we'll go ahead and save that, and we'll just call this timgray.com, since that's what is reflected in the watermark. And boom, there is our beautiful, very toned down, modest watermark in the upper right corner of the image. And we can also, we can add star ratings. So, for example, I'll just give that image a 5-star rating, so we'll be able to, I mean, just for illustrative purposes only, we'll add that star. The point is that we have some flexibility here. I'm going to switch back to a vertical image so we can see the color wash. So we can have a gradient going across the image, so we can set the opacity of that color wash. We can change the color of that color wash. We can change the angle across which it washes across the photo. We can add a background image. This sounds really cool. Oh, I'll add, a water texture to the background because that'll be a good theme for the overall images. The problem is, in reality, that tends to get a little cluttered looking. Not that I'm not making a cluttered looking slideshow here, but you get the idea. All right, background color, which obviously in this case, I had a black background color and then I added the color wash. Now I've set it to a white background color. I can make it a gray background color so you can see the two are interacting with each other. This is looking great, wouldn't you say? I can also make an intro screen. So I'll go ahead and turn on the intro screen or the ending screen, and then we can create, whatever intro screen we'd like. I'll add an identity plate, and let's go ahead and edit one, and we'll call this Wacky Slideshow, and we'll make the text, actually, what color are we using? We got it as a black background, so I'll make it nice and bold and big and white, etc. Oops, I need to set this color back to white. And we'll bring the scale up. There we go. So there's my intro screen. I could also make an ending screen that says, sorry, in this case. And so I'll go back to the beginning of the slideshow. Ooh, it's sure coming together nicely, isn't it? And I'll click the play button, and now we've got our title slide, and then we transition into whatever the timing is. We'll take a look at the timing in just a moment here. And there's the watermark and the horrible color wash and all these things that we play around with for my own amusement, basically. But the point is, obviously, if you took your time and you actually chose good settings for your slideshow, then remember we started with a template. Now we've, at least in theory, fine-tuned it to something that we like. We could create our own templates. I'll go ahead and click the plus associated with the template, and we'll call this Wacky Slideshow and create. So now, if this actually were a good template, then I could go back to the library module, for example. Let's take a look at the images we were working with previously. Go to the slideshow module, choose the Wacky Slideshow template, and play. It'll, of course, process those images and give us that playback. In addition, though, to that basic playback, which is pretty straightforward, and we've already seen it once, but here's our Wacky Slideshow once again. Obviously, I could change that title if I so chose on a case-by-case basis. But I can also change my playback settings. I can add audio if I'd like. Where are we going to get this audio?
Music files.
Rip it from a CD? No. Where are you going to get? iTunes. Are you going to pay for the music?
Of course.
Of course. I can't tell you how many photographers I've seen with unpaid music in their slideshows, and they're often the ones that complain the loudest about photos getting stolen. So pay for the music. There's actually a really great website, Incompetech. I would spell it, but I can't. Think of it as being incompetent tech, incompetech.com. He's got a bunch of free music that you can use for non-commercial purposes, or you can give them a small donation, very, very reasonable. And there's all sorts of other sources for music. If you've got said music, you can turn on the audio checkbox, select that music from your hard drive, for example, where you've got the file saved, and we can also adjust the balance. You notice here between video and music. So if you incorporate videos in your slideshow, which you can do now in Lightroom 5, if you have a video clip that you want to include as one of the slides essentially in your slideshow, you can shift the balance between the audio in your video and the audio of your music track. Do you want to hear the waves crashing in your beach video, or do you only want to hear the music, or do you want it to be balanced somewhere in between? So a nice little option there.
Can you import individual frames from a video?
Can you import individual frames? Yes.
Into the slide?
Not here. You'd have to capture the frame in Lightroom, but you'd have to capture the frame and then bring that image in. We can also adjust the slide duration, so how long do we want each image to appear, and how long do we want the transition between images, or manual, meaning you have to press the right arrow key, for example, to advance. We can set random order. We can repeat. As if anyone would sit around for that in this particular case. But also, we've seen this play option several times. Too many times, right? Take a look over at the bottom left, though. We can also export our slideshow as a PDF. By default, that PDF will open up full screen in slideshow display mode. It won't give you quite the same experience, but it's pretty darn close. And of course, the end user can escape out of full screen mode, etc. So they're not necessarily getting the slideshow experience as you intended it, but it's pretty close. But export video. This is awesome, because now you can export this slideshow as a video. And this isn't anything new, actually, so I shouldn't say now. But we can export as a video, so we can choose our resolution. So, you know, this one needs to be in HD, right? So 1080p, for example, we can specify a file name and a location, and then render that video so that the video will play back exactly as our slideshow would, or we can upload that video to YouTube or Vimeo or wherever else, where it will get 0 views in this case. All right, so pretty cool, pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to address the web module relatively briefly, not because I think it's anything less than awesome, but because I find that most photographers are not able to take full advantage of it. And the reason for that is that most photographers, at least in my experience, don't have their own domain name, don't have their own website with FTP access where they can actually upload anything they want, anywhere they want on their website. If you were something like a wedding photographer, though, it would behoove you to create your own website, even if only for this purpose. Meaning, if you need to have someone or multiple people review your images to select their favorite, or which ones they want to use for a particular project or whatnot, this is so remarkably helpful from a workflow standpoint that you absolutely have to get a domain name, even if it's a silly domain name because all of the good ones are taken. Actually, not even all the good ones. I think every alphanumeric combination with a .com on the end of it is probably taken by now. But this is really, really huge. Once again, we can have the film strip photos included in a web gallery. So, in this case, it's a mishmash, obviously, of random photos. But we can select those images, select a template that we like, fine-tune the settings over on the right. So, for example, change the site title. Scroll up here and you can see that that will change on the fly. And, sample images, or whatever the case may be. And I can fine-tune all of those settings. And now a web gallery can be generated for me automatically. Now I can save this to my disk, to my hard drive, but that's not really going to do me much good. The real value here is I can plug in my FTP settings. So down here under the server settings, I can plug in my FTP settings and click upload. Lightroom will process all of my images, generate both the large and small versions of the images, generate all of the HTML pages for that web gallery, and upload all of those to a particular location that I specify on my website. So if I were a wedding photographer, I could say, oh, your pictures are at timgray.com/insert your name here. And then I go to another client and they put their name in there, and another client, et cetera, and all of them have essentially a private URL. It's not password protected. I could make it password protected, but it's not password protected by default, but it's a private URL that nobody's going to guess. Nobody is going to timgray.com at all in the first place. And if they did, they're not going to try, you know, slash and all sorts of random names looking for galleries. And so it's a relatively safe way to share those photos. You send a private link to someone and say, here is a gallery of those photos. Go take a look. Let me know what your favorites are. So if you have your own domain name with FTP access, this can be a hugely advantageous way to share your images. The problem, of course, is that for many photographers, that's not the case. But if you have a consistent need to share images and find out from someone sort of on a relatively private basis, you just want to share with specific people and get feedback from them on which image they want for a particular purpose, this can be absolutely huge. And then finally, we have the book module, which I'm not going to go into extensive detail on. Same basic concept as what we've seen already. Look, there's my book. Select my images, select the layout. You know, I want, well, let's make it a 12 by 12. And of course, we want hardcover. Do we want an image wrap or dust jacket? Let's go dust jacket. And we want the ProLine Pearl Photo paper. And we don't want to know the estimated price. And then we can go through and we can change the layout. So for example, I can click this page and say, oh, well, for this page, I want to have 2 pictures side by side, and I want this to be the other picture, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Same basic process as what we've seen elsewhere. All that knowledge we can apply from one module to the next. But most importantly, then down at the bottom, send book to blurb. It's a tongue twister, I didn't even know it. So we can lay out our page design for all of our pages. We can even add text to the individual pages. Many of the pages support text. We can add a cover design, etc. Make all sorts of changes to that layout, and then click a button, sign into our Blurb account, and Lightroom processes all of the images, processes all of the page layouts, sends all of the files to the Blurb server, and Blurb then takes our credit card, and we can tell it how many copies of the book we want, and we've got them in the mail, and you know, a couple weeks later. So a really clever way. How many of you have already made some photo books? Pretty cool. Everybody been happy with using Blurb, I presume, in this case? So we can do that process all within Lightroom. So we can find the images based on star ratings or based on keywords or based on whatever criteria we want, bring those into the book module, create our page layouts, fine-tune as we see fit, and then directly from within Lightroom, send those images and page layouts up to Blurb and order our books. Easy breezy. Pretty cool? Well, thank you guys very, very much.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.